Hey everybody, this is Joel Meek with Meek Insurance Group, and wanted to talk about a topic that a lot of parents deal with at some point, and that is at what point should I consider moving my child onto their own policy? And most of the time there's at least one, maybe two topics that come into their mind in terms of whether or not that makes sense. One, of course, is probably price, and the other one is liability. Am I going to be able to shield myself if my child does some sort of accident and it comes back to me? And those are two really important aspects of it. There's actually some other things that you might want to consider and understand, because I'd hate for somebody to make a decision that ends up not doing what they wanted, and it actually creates a little bit more of an adverse situation for them. So let's talk through these. The first thing I would say is actually not one of those two items. It's actually ownership. So ownership matters, and when you think about your vehicle or vehicles, it may make sense to think like, oh, that's my son or that's my daughter's vehicle, when in reality, legally, they're not the one that is the owner, the sole owner of the vehicle. In fact, there may even be liens on it. You may have bought it in your name, there's a loan on the vehicle, and so it's going to be very difficult to move that over to their own policy if it's effectively tied back to you from a ownership standpoint. And a lot of parents may think, well, it's not that big of a deal because we've always viewed that as, our son or our daughter's vehicle, but in reality and legally, that may not be the case. So for example, I may think, oh, it's my son's vehicle, but in reality, my name's on the title. Well, that'd be no different than someone trying to insure my vehicle if they had no ownership in it. So just something to understand on ownership. So don't go too far if you don't have the ability to make sure the vehicle is in their name. And if there's a lien involved, you really need to talk with the lien holder to clarify as well, if you're not going to be planning to pay it off, because that may pretty much bring the whole discussion to an abrupt halt. So there's the first thing, ownership. Ownership definitely matters, and you need to make sure you understand that and check on that before you go too far down a path that turns out to be not even an option for you. Okay. Now the second thing I'm going to talk about is liability, and I know most people may think price was their main objective, but in reality, it's probably the least important of these topics. So let's talk about liability. Liability is without question a tremendously valuable thing to consider when you have a young driver in your family. Clearly, if they have an accident and the car is yours and they're on your policy, there's not much question that an attorney is going to go wherever they can possibly get the money, right? Which makes sense why a parent would probably think, hey, when can I put my child on their own policy and hopefully create some separation there. The problem with that is sometimes people have maybe the assumption of a separation, when in reality, an aggressive attorney is probably going to find the link, and this whole exercise of splitting them off and going through that whole process and the different payment and price aspects, whatever, basically comes to nothing because they were able to link them back to you anyway. All right. So I'm not giving legal advice. I want to be really, really clear on that. But the couple quick things I would say are, if you think about the idea of separating a child policy, and this assumes, of course, that they have ownership of the vehicle, and this was even possible. The problem there is, if there is still some level of dependency and linkage, again, an aggressive attorney may try to bring the parents into it, especially if there is money with the parents and there's a way to link that back. Okay, so what kind of dependency could that be? And again, this is not legal advice, but here's the things that have come into play. Number one, are they still living at home? If they're still living at home, there clearly could be some link of dependency. Now, if they've gone away and come back, I mean, it's probably going to muddy the waters at some level, but that is something that needs to at least be part of the consideration before you assume blindly that the person is no longer going to be linked to you. If they're living at home, fully dependent at home, that's probably going to be a hard argument to make and separate yourself. Second thing is, are they still being listed as a dependent on your taxes? It's going to be hard to argue if you have a child who you're still claiming as a dependent on their taxes, and yet from an asset protection standpoint, you're trying to act like they're not dependent. Again, I'm not saying this is or is not going to hold water. What I'm saying is this is a very valid argument that an aggressive attorney is going to make to try to bring the parents back into this, even though they thought they had created separation with separate policies. So don't overlook that. That is a really, really important aspect that you want to consider, because again, you don't want to have this false sense of protection and security by separating your child off, when in reality there's still clear dependency coming back. Another aspect of dependency that you might want to think about or understand would be, are they still on your health insurance, right? Have you listed them as a dependent on your health insurance? So again, whether it's taxes or health insurance, or they're still living there, if there's still dependency, just don't give yourself a false sense of protection and security and separation because you got them a separate policy. So that's really, really important to understand. So yes, there is no question, there is value and validity in trying to get them on a separate policy to help create separation of liability, but doing that prematurely when in reality there was still a lot of dependency may create that false sense of protection. So just be careful on that. Then the last thing I wanted to talk about was price, which again, I know is probably one of the main reasons that someone would consider this anyway. My experience has been this. Although it is possible that there could be some price savings by separating the two, most of the time that has not been the case. Couple reasons come into play here. Number one, if the parents had a good track record already, then their base premium, their base cost was probably much lower than someone who is a young driver with a much more limited experience. And so it's actually going to be a lower starting point in adding a young driver than it is going to be having them on their own policy. Okay, I'm not saying this is all the time. I'm just saying if the parents had a good track record, a good policy, if they had good credit, all those things come into play on auto insurance. If all those things were going pretty well with the parents, and clearly the child is not going to have nearly the tenure, nearly the experience, probably doesn't have the credit developed yet, there's a pretty good chance that the combination of the parent and the child together separately is going to be more than if they would have just stayed on the parent's policy. That doesn't mean that I'm suggesting to do that. I'm just saying that if price was the main objective, that's probably not going to play out most of the time. Now, how can that still play out that way? Well, the probably one of the main possibilities would be is if the child, if you're wanting to move them off on their own, and now they have a little more flexibility on what coverages they want, they may not, or you may not feel that they need quite the same, comprehensive, strong coverages, high liability, high uninsured motorist limits, things that maybe a parent would hopefully have in place already. I am going to explain though, I think that's a mistake. And the reason I say that is because let's assume for a second the parents had $100,000 or $250,000 in coverage, which is where most parents should have at a minimum if they have any investments, savings, future income, things like that. So I'd hope that the parents had good liability coverage to begin with. Okay. Now, someone may think, in fact, it's a common assumption, which is probably incorrect to be very honest, that when the child goes on their own, they don't need much liability coverage because they don't have much that an attorney would go after, right? I'm not going to speak for an attorney. I'm not going to say they would or wouldn't go after it. That's really not my realm. But I can say this. If you understand what comes into play in an auto accident and liability and significance of that, not only can they go after the easy money, which would probably be your auto liability limits, any liquid assets that they can get to. I'm not going to get into protected assets on this particular video. I'll do that separately. But when you look at those things and think, okay, so there's not much to go after. Here's the problem with that, I would say, incorrect assumption. It's missing the fact that they can also go after future income, right? So I just keep thinking, boy, the last thing I'd want as a young person is to get off on my own, think, hey, I don't really have anything to protect. I'm just going to strip this policy down to its, bare nothingness. And then an accident happens, and all of a sudden I've got garnished wages for the next however many years. probably not probably not the best way that any young person would want to start their life or their career. So again, the only way I've really seen where price could potentially end up less in total between the parents and the child on their separate policies instead of combined is usually by stripping the child's policy to pieces, which again I don't think I would recommend in hardly any case at all. So anyway, just thought I would talk through this particular topic. I know it is a pretty significant topic. I mean, I have kids. In fact, our kids aren't too far from that phase as well. But having seen what happens in claims and accidents and lawsuits, having seen the price differential, I did think that maybe it would be beneficial to have a video to cover these things. So anyway, I hope that helps. If you have questions, you can always ask your agent or you can contact us. And again, my name is Joel Meek, and I'm with Meek Insurance Group. Thanks so much.